Hello and you're welcome to this week's Indo Politics. I'm Tabitha Monahan. With Mercosur rearing its head again and the last-minute backtrack from Donald Trump on his plans to impose tariffs on his NATO allies, we're still in search of that quiet January week in politics. There was also a new childcare plan that was launched by government this week, and we'll come to that later. This week I'm joined from Brussels by political editor of the Irish and Sunday Independent, Mary Regan. Mary, you are in Brussels at the moment. Can you tell me what the vibe is? They were anticipating this really serious meeting with all the EU leaders on Thursday, but then kind of the wind was taken out of the sails a bit on Wednesday in Davos.
Yeah, I think this meeting was intended as a sort of crisis meeting, an emergency summit, but really an opportunity for EU leaders to put on a united front against Donald Trump's threats to impose tariffs on those countries that stood in the way of his Greenland ambitions. But the context for this meeting changed pretty dramatically, you'd have to say, on the 11th hour, when Donald Trump announced that he wasn't going to proceed with those 10% tariffs, and also when he withdrew his threat to use military means, if necessary, to seize Greenland. So where does that leave EU leaders? What do they do next? I think, they're not really quite sure. I think in some ways it makes their job a little bit easier. They will most likely forge some sort of statement that welcomes an opportunity for talks, for dialogue. After all, this is what they had wanted all along. But it could, in other ways, make their task a little bit trickier, because will they have to come up with a negotiating position? And could that be more difficult than, let's say, just facing Trump's aggressive threat straight on? Now they have to formulate a more complicated response. It would be a negotiating position that could take in a range of issues that aren't just simply related to Greenland. There are issues around broader questions around trade. There could take in aspects of Ukraine and defence. But I think underlying all of this tonight, this meeting, and it's sort of the trade war has been averted, let's say, for now. But the elephant in the room at this meeting will be the broader relationship between Europe and the United States, because people you speak to here will say that Trump would not have caved in the manner that he did had it not been for Europe playing hardball, for Europe holding out the threat of using its strongest economic weaponry, which it had never used before. And in a sense, that changes the narrative that, maybe they have been emboldened. Maybe they realise now the sort of softly approach to Donald Trump that was used in the past isn't working or hasn't worked. But more so, they will know that, yes, they were pulled back slightly from the brink for now, but they were very, very close to that particular brink, a full-on, breakdown in US-EU relations when the US was threatening to seize a sovereign territory of an ally. And I think that just changes everything. I think there's no going back from there. And I think there will be a sense that a new relationship going forward needs to be forged, whatever that might be.
Yeah, like we kind of expected up until Wednesday that a big focus of this meeting was going to be whether or not the ACI, the anti-coercion instrument, should or should not be used. We know France was really pushing for that, being really strong on that. We thought Germany was kind of going to be in favour of that as well. Do you think, maybe not necessarily in the meeting that the EU leaders are going to have now, but kind of on the outskirts of when they're all gathering, in the corridors, the kind of side chats that are having, that maybe the EU needs to come together and decide how they actually feel about using the instrument, the ACI, because it's such a severe measure? Because again, I think it feels like a lifetime since Donald Trump took over taking over in his second term as US president. We still have another 3 years of his administration. And just to think about how much has happened in that year, God only knows what could happen in another 3 years. And I wonder, is there going to be a general idea or a sense of what the game plan is from Europe going forward and what kind of approach they need to take?
Well, I think the fact that they came very close to using it, the fact that France was sort of trying to rally support of other EU member states, Germany was reported to be pretty close to supporting that. Ireland was probably by far the most cautious in relation to that particular instrument, understandably given the sort of business and economic ties we have with the US. But because they came that close, and they could argue that the threat worked in the sense that Donald Trump did remove his trade tariff threats. Now, there could be other aspects at play. You know, there could have been pressure. There was pressure coming from, you know, Republicans. There was pressure coming from other world leaders. There was pressure coming from within his own Republican Party. And some people say within his administration itself, and also pressure from the markets. So Europe can't take all the sort of credit for playing hardball here, but they will be emboldened by that. And they will say, we got so close to using this instrument before. It's there. It's in our armor to be used once again. And also they have to be able to keep their options open, particularly in relation to trade retaliatory tariffs, because they don't know how the things could change again. So yes, there's a sigh of relief for now that the trade war has been averted, but it could reopen just as easily as it was shut down, because they thought it had been shut down last August, and here they were last weekend with it opened up all over again. So they have to keep their options opened.
You were mentioning that big sigh of relief, and I can imagine that the biggest sigh of relief from our point of view definitely came from the Irish government's point of view, because we didn't know what we were going to be facing in, though we weren't on those list of countries that were going to be hit with tariffs. It was what the EU's response was going to be that could have potentially backfired on us. And you also, I think more than ever, we saw how Ireland was really caught between a rock and a hard place, literally between EU alliances and trying to placate and keep in with the US as well. And we heard Micheál Martin saying that he was going to continue going to Washington. I mean, we hear every year the opposition are saying, no, don't go to Washington. This is the year that you shouldn't go, that you need to boycott. Last year it was because there was that farcical meeting between Donald Trump in the Oval Office and Vladimir Zelensky, and it was an extraordinary meeting. And whether or not Micheál Martin was going to address that, and should he or should he not go and, you know, show resilience and support for Ukraine. This time it was going to be very different, though we didn't know what in the week or two before he was going to go in March, what he was going to be facing. We really are caught between the US and the EU. And I just wonder, was it going to come down to having to choose between one and the other?
Well, it may yet come down to that.
Yeah.
But I think that's not how Irish diplomacy likes to play things. I think it was notable that the Taoiseach was perhaps more conciliatory, far less confrontational over the past week than other member states, for example. No doubt that being because of the thousands of tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of jobs in Ireland that are dependent on business links with the United States. And also because perhaps, as you said, Micheál Martin could have found himself in the White House on St. Patrick's Day at a really difficult point in these discussions over Greenland, in the middle of what could already have been a trade war. He now won't find himself in that position. We don't know what position he will find himself in on the day, because we don't know, what Donald Trump's world might be throwing up in that particular week. But there is, one potential for, Irish soft power to come into play here, because many people would say Ireland is sort of a bystander, really, when you see the likes of France and Germany and big statements being made. But there had been a lot of pressure, soft pressure coming on Republicans in Congress over the past week or so in relation to Denmark. And while Republicans have, failed to sort of stop Trump on his tracks so far in many of his foreign policy moves, perhaps this time they may have, had their voices heard. And perhaps when Ireland has a lunch on Capitol Hill, the Speaker's lunch, which is a really unique privilege that the Irish have, then maybe that is some way that we could come in useful in this whole transatlantic row.
And it's worth mentioning as well, ahead of this meeting of the EU leaders, we still don't really know a lot of the detail of this deal that Donald Trump has managed to strike. I know he mentioned on Thursday it's a total access deal, but we're still waiting for that detail. I think that detail is waiting to be negotiated at this point. But something we do know a lot about is the detail of the deal relating to Mercosur. And there was a development then on Wednesday that saw MEPs voting to push Mercosur to the European Courts of Justice. That's a significant move. I don't know how expected or surprised you were at that. I was surprised at how tight it was. 334 votes to 324. 10 votes in the difference is very close.
Yeah, and this week is the first time the European Parliament is sitting since the Mercosur deal was voted on by member states. And there was a lot of speculation that Ireland, because it opposed the deal, would be sort of on the naughty step in Europe, as it were, and it wouldn't go down favourably with our European colleagues. And that theory is, let's say, only being put to the test this particular week. And the sense that I'm getting from talking to people who are in the European Parliament in Strasbourg already is that this is being mentioned on the sidelines of meetings by their colleagues. People are not happy with how Ireland voted. And, you know, Micheál Martin might find out when he goes to speak to his European Council colleagues today how exactly that particular decision by Ireland has gone down. But as you said, this roadblock put in the way of the Mercosur deal by MEPs in the European Parliament. The European Parliament, when they get a chance, like to sort of flex their muscles and show that they're an institution that matters. However, Germany is coming out today, and remember, Germany is chief backer of this Mercosur trade deal. It's massive for their car industry in particular. And it's urging the European Commission to just forge ahead and implement the deal in spite of what the European lawmakers have voted. So that could be shaping up to be something of a clash between the European institutions, the Parliament, the European Council and the Commission. Again, something that could potentially be, you know, taking shape when Ireland holds the presidency of the EU in the second half of this year.
That would be a massively contentious decision, though, to go ahead and push through, even on a preliminary, a temporary basis, putting Mercosur through, when MEPs have very clearly made a decision what way they think it should go for now. Like, potentially this is going to delay Mercosur by 2 years, if not derail it, but at the very least delay it by 2 years, because that's how long the court takes to make opinions or take opinions on this.
Yes, and also, like, the European, under the EU treaties, the European Commission does have the right or the entitlement to sort of plough ahead with this deal temporarily until such time as that decision is made. So the EU Commission can go ahead and do this if they want to. So it's sort of the clash of the sort of democratically elected institution, the European Parliament, claiming it's the most, you know, has the greatest democratic legitimacy of all the European institutions, versus what the European Commission might believe is the sort of real politic, the sort of political reality that now, more than ever, in light of the week that has just been, the EU wants more autonomy from the United States. It wants to forge different alliances, and it wants to show that it's not dependent on them. And what better way to do that than to plough ahead with this, what would be what they're describing as the mother of all trade deals.
I want to pick up on what you said earlier on about speaking to MEPs in Strasbourg, and that kind of on the sidelines, that they're really getting feedback that Ireland is on the naughty step, is in the bad books with Mercosur. Do you think that could be just a temporary thing? That, you know, it's still quite recent since the vote, and that maybe over time, like, we do have a 2-year delay anyway now, that maybe in 2 years' time so much will have happened that Ireland's kind of standing and reputation won't have taken that much of a knock? Or do you think actually it is quite serious?
Well, I think the real test will be, or the real issue that Europe might have with Ireland, is related to defence spending, and the fact that many EU member states are looking at us, as someone, you know, in government described to me, they're looking at us with their mouths open and their eyes watering at the amount of corporation tax that Ireland is taking in from the multinationals, and all these billions sitting there that we are not spending on defence, whereas other countries are eating into budgets that they might have for other public services to spend on their defence. I think that is one particular tricky issue between Ireland and other member states. But I think there's a problem arising in relation to sort of a breakdown in trust, because it's been put, you know, to some MEPs that the nitrates derogation extension was given to Ireland as a sort of a quid pro quo for backing Mercosur. And we sort of took the derogation extension and then sort of did the dirty by not keeping our side of the bargain.
I just don't know how the government moves on then from that, because the decision has been made to vote against Mercosur. You know, Micheál Martin still has to go to these meetings and these summits. Is there any way for Ireland to regain any kind of popularity, because like you were saying, we're really not in the good books when it comes to defence. So there's just these mounting examples of why Ireland isn't doing what it should be doing as an EU member. Like we hear constantly from the government, especially around Mercosur in the last kind of 2 weeks, we're a net contributor to the EU. We don't go with our begging bowl to the EU. I don't know if necessarily the EU cares about that. I mean, it would be so much worse if we weren't a net contributor, but I don't know, does that make enough of a difference?
You know, we possibly have a little bit of cover in the fact that France, which describes itself as our nearest EU neighbour, has also voted against Mercosur. And I guess where the rebuilding of relations might come about is when Ireland holds the presidency of the Council. So the Commission will be sort of doing deals with the Council under Ireland's presidency. So, you know, there will be new factors coming into play in terms of that relationship.
Something what I was looking at this week is the government's new childcare plan for the state-led childcare, which I think was kind of overshadowed by everything else that was going on this week. There were such massive stories, particularly internationally speaking, that I don't think it got the same level of focus that it usually would have. This is the government's plan to start buying up properties, buying up buildings, refurbishing them across the country. Hopefully, the first year it'll bring about 800 school places. What strikes me about this programme or this initiative is that, and I think we said this actually before a few weeks ago when we were talking about the VAT cut on apartments, this is something that really has to work, because we know that there's chronic undersupply of places. I think 40,000 children are on waiting lists for childcare places at the moment. I mean, not getting into the affordability side of things and the massive promise of the €200 per child per month cap, you know, which the government says it'll be over the course of the government that they will be achieving that. But it really is one of those strategies that 800 places is such a small dent. It's a drop in the ocean in terms of 40,000 school places. This really is an initiative that just they have to get right.
And the fact that it informed so much of their pre-election promises, and that promise by Fine Gael in particular to have it published how they would get to the €200 in the first 100 days in office. So they had a great sense of emergency and urgency around this at the time of the election. But also they have to get it right, you know, not just for, you know, children and ensuring that there are the, you know, adequate and safe and secure and healthy, you know, services in place, but also because there is a employment, you know, in this country is reaching full capacity. I mean, in Ireland, and you know, there's a need to increase employment, and one of the ways that can be done is through engaging more women in the workplace. And so long as there are inadequate provisions of childcare and women can't return to work because they can't get childcare places, that is taking a cohort of women out of the workforce.
No, absolutely right. And it is keeping women out of the workforce. It's keeping parents out of the workforce. You would have to expect that and I know that is part of the promise, is that they will ramp this up, that, you know, they'll start by looking at up to 8 buildings over the first year of this, and then they will ramp it up over the next kind of 4 years, the funding coming from the National Development Plan. But also affordability is a massive part of that as well. And I think and like you said, you know, it's starting to come up a lot more in the last few weeks, that particular Fine Gael promise of setting out exactly how they're going to do that. But there seems to be a complete pivot by the government. While they're saying, yeah, we're looking at the affordability, we're going to again bring in, you know, different thresholds for the maximum amount of subsidies that parents can get. We're going to bring in maximum caps on the highest fees that are paid across the country. So they are doing little bits. It just seems like a very, very long way away before we see the €200 per child per month, doesn't it?
Yes, and the thing about childcare is that most people are only in the system or using the system for a couple of years of their life. So there might be people who voted in the last election on that promise, but by the time it comes into pass and into effect, they no longer have their kids in childcare. So it is one of those areas that the government, you know, made big talk on. So really, you know, has to sort of start getting right sooner rather than later if they're to show that they're delivering on their pre-election promises.
Mary, I think we'll leave it there and let you back off to Brussels to see what Micheál Martin has to say for himself ahead of this EU meeting. Thank you, Mary, for joining me today. And thank you all for tuning in to this week's episode of Indo Politics. We'll be back same time, same place next week. You can find us on Irish Independent's YouTube channel and anywhere you get your podcasts.